You stand in the center of a stone chamber, the air thick with the scent of burning cedar and stale incense. It is pitch black, save for the flickering light of a single oil lamp placed on the floor, casting long, dancing shadows against walls covered in reliefs you cannot quite see. You are young. You are trembling. The silence here is not peaceful. It is heavy, pressing against your eardrums like the weight of deep water. You hear the shuffling of sandals on stone, hundreds of feet moving in unison outside, yet inside you are utterly alone. You are waiting for a door to open that will never truly let you back out. The year is 1763 BCE. You are in the heart of the city of Sippar, near the banks of the Euphrates. The heat of the day has faded, leaving only the cold emanating from the temple floor. You have been told this is an honor. You have been told that to be chosen is to be elevated above the common dust of the streets. But as the heavy bronze gates grind shut behind you, the finality of the sound settles into your bones. The world you knew, the market noise, the river's flow, the faces of your kin, has been severed from you. You are no longer a daughter of a merchant or a farmer. You are becoming a vessel, a silent component in a machine much larger than yourself. What followed would shape their lives in ways few outside the palace ever understood. To the modern observer, looking back through the fragmented lens of archaeology, the great ziggurats and sprawling temple complexes of Mesopotamia appear as monuments to spiritual devotion. We see the majesty of the architecture, the intricate cuneiform tablets, and the statues of gods with wide, staring eyes. But strip away the romanticism of antiquity, and a far colder reality emerges. This was not merely religion. It was a system of absolute control, engineered with bureaucratic precision. The rituals faced by young girls in these ancient city-states were not random acts of cruelty born of chaos. They were policy. They were the calculated byproduct of a civilization that had mastered the art of organizing human beings as efficiently as it organized grain or water. In the empires of Sumer, Babylon, and Akkad, the temple was not just a house of worship. It was the state's bank, its granary, and its judicial center. And like any massive institution, it required human resources to function. The girls selected for these roles, whether as high-ranking Naditu priestesses or the cloistered Naditu, entered a life governed by strictures so rigid that they functioned as a form of incarceration. The archives recovered from these sites do not speak of spiritual ecstasy. They speak of quotas, of legal contracts, and of severe penalties for stepping out of line. The horror of their experience does not lie in chaotic violence, but in the terrifying order of it all. It was a normalization of total ownership, where a human life was transferred from the authority of a father to the authority of a god, with the state holding the deed. As we unravel these ancient layers, we find that the most chilling aspects of history are often the ones buried under the guise of tradition. At Dark Inquest History, we are committed to excavating these silenced narratives, brushing away the dust of centuries to reveal the human cost behind the monuments. The life of a young girl entering the Gagum, the walled cloister within the city, began with a systematic stripping of identity. This was not a sudden event, but a slow, methodical process designed to ensure that the individual will was replaced by the collective will of the institution. The physical walls of the cloister were high, often described in texts as separating the sacred from the profane, but in practice they separated the women from the world. Once inside, the psychological conditioning began. These women were often referred to as the brides of the god, a title that carried immense social weight but demanded a terrifying price. They were forbidden from bearing children, a restriction that, in a society where a woman's value was often tied to lineage, effectively erased their biological legacy. They became dead to the biological cycle of the city, existing in a suspended state of perpetual service. The daily rituals were grueling. They were not filled with mystical wonder, but with labor and silence. The Naditu were economic powerhouses, managing vast estates and lending silver, yet they lived in strict confinement. Imagine the psychological dissonance. Possessing the power to ruin merchants with a sealed tablet, yet lacking the freedom to walk through the city gates. They were the engine of the temple's wealth, yet they remained captives of its stone walls. The fear that permeated their lives was the fear of a mistake. In a system where the king's law, such as the Code of Hammurabi, dictated the severest of punishments for priestesses who strayed, every action was a potential trap.
A priestess who was found in a tavern, or who even opened a tavern, faced the penalty of being burned. This was not a metaphorical threat. It was a legal statute, carved into black diorite pillars for all to see. The state did not need to use the whip daily. The presence of the pillar was enough. The terror was atmospheric. It hung in the air like the dust of the plains. It was a discipline of the mind, forcing these young women to police themselves, to internalize the cage until the bars were no longer necessary, because they existed within their own thoughts.
We must pause to consider the specific individuals who bore this weight. History often records titles, not names, but occasionally a voice breaks through the silence of the clay tablets. We find records of women like Iltani, a Naditu of Sippar. Her name appears on hundreds of administrative documents, leases, loans, harvest records. She was a woman of business, a formidable figure in the economic life of the city. But read closer, between the lines of the ledger. There are letters from family members, pleading or demanding, reminders of her duty, reminders of her isolation. There is a profound loneliness etched into the subtext of these transactions. She was a pillar of the community, yet she lived apart from it, observing the lives of her brothers and sisters from behind a veil of sanctity. The human cost here is not measured in blood spilled on an altar, but in the years of silence endured in a small stone room. It is measured in the family gatherings missed, the children never held, the realization that one is an asset to the temple first, and a human being second. For the young girls of the lower classes, the rituals were different, but no less terrifying.
Debt bondage was a harsh reality of the Mesopotamian economy. A farmer, crushed by drought or high interest rates, might be forced to pledge a daughter to the temple or a wealthy creditor to pay off a loan. This was a ritual of exchange, a transaction where a child became currency. These girls did not enter the cloisters of the Naditu with dowries and legal protections. They entered the shadows of the temple workforce or the households of the elite as laborers. Their ritual was the ritual of erasure. They were scrubbed from their family trees, their names changed, their pasts severed.
The fear they faced was the fear of total vulnerability. In a world of strict hierarchy, to be a debt slave was to be without protection. They existed at the mercy of their masters, their well-being dependent entirely on the temperament of those who owned their debt. The texts describe harsh discipline for those who were disobedient. We do not need graphic descriptions to understand what this implies. The euphemisms of the ancient scribes, phrases like correction or instruction, mask a reality of systemic abuse hidden from official records. These girls learned to make themselves invisible. They learned that survival meant silence. They learned that the gods of Babylon were great and terrible, and that their representatives on earth held the power of life and death. If you believe that recognizing the endurance of these forgotten figures is a duty we owe to the past, then you understand the mission we are on. It is a journey into the shadows, not to exploit them, but to witness them. The climax of this systemic control came when the stability of the empire faltered. The rituals and structures that imprisoned these women relied on the order of the state. When the state crumbled, whether through invasion by the Elamites, the Hittites, or through internal collapse, the precarious safety of the cloister evaporated. Imagine the moment the news reaches the sanctuary. The city walls have been breached. The orderly chanting of the priests stops, replaced by the chaotic screams of the streets. For the Naditu and the Entu, the high walls that had been their prison for decades suddenly became a trap. The very isolation that defined their lives now ensured their inability to escape. There are layers of destruction found in the archaeological record of the Gagum at Sippar. Layers of ash, broken relics. This marks the moment when the ritual of control spiraled into a ritual of destruction. The women who had been the brides of the god found that the god could not save them from the torches of the invaders. The sanctuary was violated not just physically, but symbolically. The extinguishing of the sacred fires represented the end of their world. In these final moments, the terrifying nature of their existence crystallized. They had given up everything, their autonomy, their families, their very names, for a system that promised order. And in the end, the system abandoned them to the chaos. The betrayal was absolute. The fear in those final hours, as the smoke filled the stone corridors, was the realization that their sacrifice had purchased no safety. They were the guardians of a spiritual treasury that was being looted, left to face the consequences of a war started by kings they had never met. The aftermath of such collapses was often a long, slow silence. When new rulers took over, or when the city was rebuilt, the lives of these specific women were rarely reconstituted. They became footnotes in the king lists, or statistical data in the recovery of grain supplies. The institution might be restored, but the individuals were gone. The cultural memory of Mesopotamia is vast, preserved on hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. But there is a selectivity to what was written down. The scribes recorded the triumphs of kings, the construction of canals, and the omens of the stars. They did not record the internal emotional landscape of the girl sold for silver. They did not document the nightmares of the woman locked in the cloister. These stories were not erased by time, but by design. They were considered irrelevant to the narrative of power. Yet, the evidence remains for those willing to look. It is in the cracked seal of a letter never sent. It is in the amulet found in the dust, a small token of personal protection in a world of state-imposed danger. It is in the very architecture of the ruins, the thickness of the walls, the darkness of the inner sanctums. These stones speak of a society that feared the chaotic power of the feminine and sought to bind it with laws, rituals, and stone. The legacy of these practices echoed through the centuries. The concept of the cloistered woman, the bride of the deity, the commodification of the daughter. These ideas did not vanish with the fall of Babylon. They mutated, evolved, and found their way into the structures of later civilizations. The shadow of the ziggurat is long, and it stretches further into human history than we often care to admit. When we analyze the legal codes of the time, such as the Middle Assyrian laws, we see an escalation in the control of women, a tightening of the veil. The terrifying rituals of the earlier periods laid the groundwork for a society where the public visibility of women was increasingly restricted. The fear that began in the temple rituals seeped out into the streets, becoming a generalized cultural anxiety that demanded the containment of female agency. We must also consider the psychological legacy. A society that builds its spiritual and economic institutions on the suppression of a specific group creates a fracture in its own soul.
The rigid order of Mesopotamia, with its obsession with lists and categories, was a defense mechanism against the chaos of the world. By rigidly defining the role of these young girls, by locking them into unchangeable destinies, the society tried to bargain with fate. They offered up the freedom of their daughters in exchange for the favor of the storms and the floods. But the storms still came. The floods still rose, and the sacrifice of human potential remained a stain on the conscience of the empire, even if that conscience was rarely voiced in the official texts. The suffering endured behind the closed doors of the Gagum was a quiet suffering, a misery of attrition rather than explosion. It was the slow wearing down of the spirit, the day after day of sameness, the watching of the sun track across the same patch of floor, knowing that the world outside was moving on without you. To stand in the ruins of these places today is to feel the weight of that silence. The wind blows through the broken arches, and the sand covers the floors where the Naditu once walked. It is easy to see only the romance of the ruin, the aesthetic beauty of decay. But we must force ourselves to see the reality that existed when the walls were whole. We must imagine the heavy doors shut tight. We must imagine the sound of the key turning. We must imagine the darkness that fell when the oil lamp burned low, and the devastating realization that this darkness was the only future one would ever know. The terrifying rituals of ancient Mesopotamia were not monsters in the night. They were the laws of the land. They were the contracts signed by fathers. They were the prayers chanted by priests. They were the terrified obedience of children who had no choice but to comply. It was a terror born of civilization itself, a reminder that the most organized societies can also be the most cruel. As the dust settles on this inquest, we are left not with the grandeur of empires, but with the quiet, lingering unease of lives lived in the shadow of absolute power. This channel exists to ensure that the silence of the past does not become the amnesia of the present. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe to help us keep the flame of their memory alive.